first session of the day is Essentials in Clinical Research in the Innovative Infant Formula Market, presented by Dr. Annegret Nielsen, Senior Consultant at Analyze and Realize GmbH. In order to obtain market authorizations for novel infant formulas, typically high-quality clinical studies are required. This presentation will address how to avoid common pitfalls, selecting the right study sites, ensuring optimal subject recruitment, and how to tackle logistic challenges. Without further ado, Dr. Nielsen, you have the floor.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having us here, and welcome to the first presentation of today. The Essentials in Clinical Research in the Innovative Infant Formula Market. And I would like to start with the short regulatory framework, and then we could do a deep dive in the study conduct and how to avoid common pitfalls, selecting the right study sites, and ensuring optimal subject recruitment, and how to tackle logistic challenges. Indeed, at A&R, we have quite some experiences with clinical trials in the past, and I would like to give you an overview of our experience and how to avoid these common pitfalls. This is a short overview on the global retail market for baby milk and food in 2021. And as you can see, the market volume per capita consumption and also the annual growth vary widely worldwide, but still it's a growth area also in main EU markets. And now, maybe this is usually a bit the boring part, but that is, of course, also a very important part, the regulation. So infant food and follow-on formula is regulated under the Food for Specific Group regulation. And there you have these food for specific medical purposes, the total diet replacement for weight reduction, and this is really one of the main parts of the FSG regulation, the food for infants and young children. And here we have the delegated regulations for infant and follow-on formula. And if you go a bit deeper into the regulation or the delegated regulation, you can find a clear requirement to do studies in order to demonstrate the suitability as well as the safety of innovative ingredients for infant formula and follow-on formula. And also not only the regulation itself, but also EFSA, the European Food Safety Authority, provided a guideline on the essential composition of infant food and follow-on formula. And here we also clearly requested that new technologies, but also the protein hydrolysis that need to be established by clinical evaluation, really in order to prove the safety of the new ingredients, the innovative novel ingredients for this very, how to say, vulnerable target group. So now coming to the clinical trials, and at the first, I would like to draw your attention to relevant guidelines. And there are different guidelines, and they all highlight a bit the requirements on the study design and how to conduct studies in infants. So just to mention some of them is the Scientific Committee on Food. That is really a very vulnerable guideline. But also, if you're focusing also on the US market, the FDA guideline is really highly recommendable. And now to the key points, and these key points are more or less the same across the different guidelines. First of all, the study population that is usually healthy term infants at the age of 0 days until 14 days, and the duration of most of the studies is about 3 to 4 months. Some are a bit longer for 6 months. And the primary outcome parameters in order to substantiate the safety of the product is body weight, body length, and head circumstance. And of course, it is also possible to measure other secondary outcome parameters, the microbiota, for example, also immune marker, although this is a bit more complicated as you usually need to draw blood, and also different kind of questionnaires, electronic-based questionnaires is also something you can consider as a secondary parameter. And also a very important aspect is the comparator. So that needs to be really close to the investigational product, and usually that should be from the local market. This is, for example, a prerequisite for the US market. So if you really would like to do or to market an innovative ingredient in infant food on the US market, the study needs to be done with a comparator from the local market. Now we come to the feasibility of such infant studies, and to start with the identification of countries and regions. So where are the countries and regions which could be ideally used for an infant study or for a study center to conduct the infant studies? And there's a broad overview on the percentage of infants breastfed at the age of 3 months in Europe. And at the age of about 6 months, only about a quarter of the infants are still breastfed, and the percentage or the proportion of breastfed infants really is very different across the EU countries, and that could be something you should consider prior or for the planning of your trial. And another very important aspect is that the mothers need to refuse to breastfeeding. So this is really the first decision, and then you only can include the baby into the study. Another aspect regarding the feasibility are certainly the study sites, and this is, I have to say, really different to the, how to say, conventional clinical studies for LDL cholesterol reduction. Because, of course, the study population is completely different. So if you consider to conduct a trial in a hospital, or you like to have a study site as a hospital, you should be aware, or you should request the number of births, but also how many of the children were breastfed versus fed via infant formula. And what is also an advantage, that is what we learned, is that you have in the hospital a department really being aware of the clinical research, or really having a clinical research department in the hospital. That really makes life much easier, because then you can really communicate to someone who is aware of the different issues you may have with the conducting the trial. You can also, of course, go to private practices. The advantage here is that there is usually a very close relationship between the mothers or the parents and the doctors. And also midwife centers, children's nurses, or pediatric network could be something you can choose as a study site. But to summarize it, the take-home message is really you need an international network. According to our experience, conducting an infant study just in one country, it is of course feasible, but it definitely will prolong the duration of the study. And choose really local experience and motivated investigators, and also include key opinion leaders, and that is really crucial for the study conduct. Now to the study population, which is, as I already said, really completely different to what is usually included in a clinical study. And as you can imagine, of course, it is a highly vulnerable study group, and infants and small children are not small adults, and that is really something you need to have always in mind. And what is also a point, and maybe those who already have own children, getting a child is really changing your life. It's a new situation for the whole family, and therefore you really need to have study persons who know that, and you have a very close and trustful relationship, and that is really much more important than for other clinical studies. You should also be aware of the fact that in the meantime the mothers are just for 1 or 2 days in the hospital, and that needs to be considered in order to get into contact with the mothers. And the influence of third parties or of third persons, be it medical professionals or relatives, are also important, and that needs to be taken into consideration. So finally, well-experienced investigators are really, really important for this sensitive study population. And to make it a bit more specific, more detailed, the subject recruitment, and that I already mentioned, is related to the fact that the mothers are usually leaving the hospital after 1, maximally 2 days. So that needs to be taken into consideration, but you cannot go into contact with the mothers before birth. That does make sense in a way. And then what we realized is that you definitely have mothers really decided immediately that they would not like to breastfeed their children. But there's usually a kind of a transition period, and that is not in the hospital. That is after 8, 9, 10 days, where the mothers realize it does not work really with the breastfeeding, and they would like to use now the infant formula, and that needs to be taken into consideration because this is a really high percentage of the mothers. And then something else that is important is that there need to be a kind of a trust in the investigational product, but of course also to the comparator. And what we realized in our first clinical trial with infants is that parents usually would like to feed their children until 6 months and do not want to change after the study end at 4 months, for example. So that is usually something that attracts a bit the inclusion to the study, that you provide the study product over the usual study duration. And one, I would say that is really a pitfall, is that you usually have to handle a high dropout rate. And also the compliance is a challenge, as the mothers are, not that, the compliance is just an issue with the mothers, with the new family situation and so forth. So again, here a close contact and relationship between the study staff and the parents is really highly important. And the large sample size, that is really a point that needs to be taken into consideration for the sample size calculation and this high dropout rate. Then another aspect, what we realized is the ethical approval. And it is not only across different EU countries, it's also sometimes within one country. That you may be faced with different argumentations from ethical committees. So, for example, where are countries in the EU who consider an infant trial as a drug study, at least from the ethical committee perspective. So that needs to be taken into consideration. While in other countries, this is not the case, but they would like to see a signed contract from the medical doctor before you submit the paperwork to the ethical committee, which is really a kind of a challenge, I would say. And also the background and the focus of the different local ethic committees may differ. Therefore, preparing the study documentation is really something you need to be very careful, and you should always adhere to the guidelines, to the regulations, and you need to have a solid argumentation why you need to do this study. And also highly recommended is to include experts to substantiate the argumentation. Now to the investigational product, and this is really something one should be aware of, is that you need to adhere to the local regulations. And that may be even different across EU countries. There in some countries, the protein content, for example, may be an issue with the study conduct. And also in the US, that's something I already mentioned, here you really need to have a product that is also marketed on the US market. Then you need an appropriate comparator that should be really close to the investigational product. And another thing that makes this kind of study really different to these tablet-style studies is that you need really a large storage capacity, because the study duration is 4 months, and we are not talking about 1 tablet a day. It's really the infant food that is really, yeah, you need this large storage. And what we implemented in our CRO at Analyze and Realize is a sophisticated electronic logistic tool in order to handle the different study sites and really see there is what missing and so forth. This is really, really important. Otherwise, it's really, really chaotic, or it's becoming really chaotic. So, and then at the end, I would like to show you one of our trials we conducted in the last year that was published last year. It was a study in more than 300 newborns. Newborns that includes also a microbiota sub-study, and that was conducted in different EU countries and with different study sites. And that is really also something that is important, and that is a bit, I think, the point why we just needed 6 to 12 months for recruitment is that we really, really work with quite a number of study sites across EU. And they implemented the sophisticated logistic tools that makes life much, much easier. And that was just briefly the study flowchart. So we had the investigational product, the control group, and that another group that was with breastfeeding children. That was a reference group that is not mandatory for regulatory purposes, but that is also interesting to compare it with the infant formula-fed children. And this voluntary, that is what I mentioned before, that was just because the parents, as I mentioned, don't want to or didn't want to change the infant food, and therefore they get a bit more of the products. So this is very briefly the outcome. The outcome is there was no difference between the target group in terms of weight, length, and head circumstances. And at the end of the day, one can conclude that the formula is safe and well tolerated by healthy-term infants during the first months of life. That was a product that contains this human milk oligosaccharide, and that was compared to a product without this HMO. So at a glance, the most important things for infant studies is, that is of course always the case for clinical studies, is a very solid preparation. But for this specific vulnerable study group, it is a bit more important to really be aware of the regulation, the study protocol, the ethic protocol, and that really everything is well prepared. And in terms of feasibility, this is really, in that sense, important that you really need to choose the most appropriate region and country to conduct the studies, and also to find a experienced study site in the different EU countries. And that brings us to the network. This is also important in terms of really good results. And the empathy, that is really something that is different, really, really different to other studies, which is of course also important for adults, but it is really a bit other story if you're talking with a newborn mother, if you would like to tell it like that. So we're talking about a highly vulnerable study group, and therefore, people are a bit more sensitive to these kind of studies. So that's from my side. So if you have questions, please feel free to ask.